Hello, how are you? My name is Aisha, and today I'd like to speak to you about the Ocoee Massacre. This happened in 1920, and this is American history. This story is basically about voter suppression towards the Black community and just how evil Americans were and are, and why you should pretty much never forget your history. So this article is from Pegasus.com, and I'm going to leave this article in the description down below. So here we go. The truth laid bare. It's taken nearly 100 years for healing to begin from the 1920 Ocoee Massacre. Somewhere between the evil of that night and the long overdue commemorations of today are timeless lessons you might not expect. Gladys Franks Bell woke up 3 minutes ago and her phone is ringing again. I've been getting so many phone calls these last few months, she says. People want to ask me what happened to my dad's family that night. Daddy will always be a hero to a lot of people. That night was Election Day, November 2nd, 1920, known as the Ocoee Massacre. It is one of the most horrific examples of racial hatred imaginable. Dozens of Black people were killed. More than 200 others were ran out of town in the then unincorporated part of West Orange County, fleeing from bullets and their homes or their burning homes. Among them, 18-year-old Richard Allen Franks, who led his 6 younger siblings through muck and alligator-infested water in the middle of the night to safety in Plymouth, Florida, where Franks Bell was born, raised and lives to this day at the age of 81. On his back, Allen, as he was known, carried his brother Cornell, who had paraplegia. Daddy was about 6 feet tall with strong hands, Franks Bell says, but he was a giant of a man because he cared about everyone. I mean everyone. You know, the details of that night are in my book. That's what everyone seems to want. She's referring to Visions Through My Father's Eyes, which she self-published in 2015. The acts inflicted by a mob that night and the fear that followed, it's all in there. But in her conversations, she'd like to focus on something else. My father never allowed any room for hate, none. And that leaves anyone who's listening to wonder, how could that possibly be? Because he's compassionate. No matter what these devils do, some people just have compassion. That might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. Personally, even though I believe in an eye for an eye, I still believe that you don't have to be hateful because people do hateful things to you. God bless them. I ain't there. I don't see how anyone could overlook people burning your homes down because of the color of your skin, because you want to vote. It's beyond me. So, like Frank Bells and other Black children who grew up on the west side of Orange County through most of the 20th century, Francina Boykin was told to avoid Ocoee. The abusive treatment of Black people, however, wasn't confined to the Ocoee city limits. Boykin had rocks thrown at her whenever she walked from her home in Apopka to the neighborhood store. Her grandfather was badly beaten by members of the KKK. When it came to Ocoee, she says, we just didn't go there, and we didn't ask why. Unspoken memories of that night haunted the region for nearly 80 years. Any kind of redemption had been muffled in the silent chasm between then and now, between white and black. Why do they always make it seem like every single time some crazy racial ish goes on, if you notice, just peep game next time, they say that it's an American problem. They don't say which Americans are the problem. I mean, we understand why they wouldn't, because that would make them look bad. But they're always talking about how there's a racial divide, there's racial problems, when we all kind of can gather who's really doing it, or at least who was doing it back then. It wasn't the black people that were going around hanging people from trees, burning down towns. That's exactly why when shit gets real here, I feel nothing. When shit starts getting we have to acknowledge the bad part of our history, says UCF Associate Professor of History Robert Casanello, who has spent 15 years researching Ocoee and trying to understand what went so terribly wrong. That's how we grow, by seeing ourselves in it. Are you kidding me? What went wrong? Oh gosh, we're here again. Everybody playing stupid. So let's first see ourselves in the early 1900s. Black people were moving in from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. They found opportunity in the fruit-bearing land of Orange County and bought parcels of citrus groves and made them flourish. Boykin remembers the gentleman in Apopka once telling her, the people from Ocoee would come riding over here on horses with gold tassels. We thought, they must be doing well over there. By 1920, some Black Ocoee residents were driving nice cars and planning to send kids to college. Well, that's where it starts. One of them, July Perry, had become a prominent businessman who would help broker land deals and arrange work for people. He also began registering Black residents to vote. They were doing what Booker T. Washington had proposed in his Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, says Connie Lester, UCF Associate Professor of History and editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. He said that by working hard, acquiring property, and becoming a vital part of the economy, white people will see your contribution and accept you as voters. I'm sorry, that's not funny. I'm not laughing at them. I'm laughing that they actually thought that these people that since then, well, prior to then, were hanging you and doing all kinds of crazy shit to you, and you thought you was going to be on the same level field. That's what I'm laughing at. The test of acceptance came with the 1920 presidential election. Republican Warren Harding versus Democrat James Cox. The NAACP actively registered Black voters throughout Florida. John Chaney, a white attorney and former judge running for U.S. Senate, strongly encouraged Black residents in Orange County to exercise their right. I'm sure they were excited to vote, says Robert Hickey, whose grandfather, John Hickey, had grand plans for the 120 acres he owned in Ocoee. That is awesome. But an opposing force loomed. Chaney received a letter saying if any Black residents attempted to vote, there will be serious trouble. The daughter of a prominent white Ocoee official would tell a researcher nearly 50 years later that 90% of all law enforcement officers, judges, public servants, and lawyers in Winter Garden and Ocoee were Klan members. We already knew that. Like, really? Don't play stupid, guys. You don't have to play stupid just because they want you to be stupid. The KKK held parades around the state in a show of intimidation 3 days before the election. Kind of what they're doing now, right? The cultural touchstones of the time were being threatened, white supremacy among them. When that happens, it creates angst, sometimes in the form of violence. So once again, You can play stupid if you want, but I'm going to keep it all the way 100 with you. These were white folks doing this to you. You were not doing shit to anyone except being black, living, thriving, working. And they were like, I'm about to just bust a cap just because. But they always want to make it seem like it's America has a racial problem. No, it's a certain group that has a racial problem with everyone else. As soon as we figure that out, we can move forward. Time and silence have slightly blurred the exact sequence of events on November 2nd, 1920, but most accounts agree on this montage. Mose Norman pulled his car up to the Ocoee polling precinct that morning to vote. He was denied and drove to Orlando to tell Cheney, who told Norman to go back and take the names of anyone suppressing his rights. When Norman returned to Ocoee with Cheney's message, gunshots were fired. Norman escaped that night, and into the next morning, Sam Salisbury rallied a mob of as many as 200 white men around the region to find Norman. They surrounded the home of Norman's friend, July Perry. More gunfire ensued. The people living in Ocoee's black neighborhood ran for safety. Some were caught, some were shot, some were never heard from again. Perry was beaten, shot, jailed, dragged, and lynched. Stories over the years have said between 30 and 80 black people died that night. The stories also confuse who shot first and who said what. The whites shot first. The whites didn't want them to vote. Case closed. Stop playing these games. The particulars might be debated. Whatever. It depends on who you ask, says Lester. But they can't get in the way of the substance. That's the issue that lingers. Armstrong Hightower hid in the citrus groves with his sister. His description 80 years later would paint a vivid picture of the particulars and substance. That's the night the devil got loose in Ocoee. The fires set by the mob burned a hellish hole right through the black community. Norman fled to Stuckey, Florida, and then to Harlem. Perry's wife escaped to Tampa with their teenage daughters. Coretha, John Hickey had to abandon his 120 acres and his dreams. Wow. Everything he pursued came to a screeching halt, says Robert Hickey, and there was nothing he could do about it. The entire horrific truth began to be erased as soon as July Perry's body was lowered from the light pole. Some sources say it was a tree limb near the Orlando home of John Cheney, who lost the Senate race that night. The 1920 census said 255 black residents and 560 white residents lived in Ocoee. Within months of the Election Day massacre, no more than 2 black residents remained. From the 1930s into the 1970s, not a single black person lived in the city. Few would even go near it, as the eerie silence permeated the entire region. Permeated the entire region. After the massacre, newspapers advised that order had been restored, and everyone should stop talking about whatever happened, Lester says. In 2019, report from the Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability includes an item that apparently floated within the sea of denials. It's an advertisement in the December 12, 1920 edition of the Orlando Centennial. Special bargains, several beautiful little groves belonging to the Negroes that have just left Ocoee. Must be sold. See B.M. Sims. Sims was one of Ocoee's wealthiest white landowners. In July 1921, the Orlando Centennial reported that another angry mob had injured a black man, George Betsy, because he talked too much about the trouble at Ocoee last November. The next newspaper article known to be published with any hint of the real story would be 65 years later, in 1986, the year Ocoee hired its first city worker. So how did the truth disappear about what the Orange County Regional History Center calls the largest incident of voting day violence in the United States history? As the character Roger Verbal Kent popularized in the movie The Usual Suspects, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. This year, 100 years after the massacre, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a law directing schools across Florida to teach students about Ocoee's Election Day Massacre. A section of the State Road 438 in Ocoee has been renamed July Perry Highway. A historic marker will be dedicated in another part of the city. What you see now is the easy part, Boykin says. The hard part has been finding people to open up. White people took great pains to not breathe a word about it, says Casanello. The Black people, like anyone who experiences trauma, probably didn't want to relive it. Robert Hickey says he would hear bits and pieces about the massacre while eating oranges with his grandkids in the 1950s, but he says, I no idea of the gravity of it all. I just knew my grandfather was bitter about something. Bitterness, trauma, deceit. It all simmered. Fear was the lid that kept it from boiling. To talk about it was to perhaps invite more problems. Author Zora Neale Hurston penned a story in 1939 titled The Ocoee Riot, which wasn't published until 1989. In 1969, Lester Dabbs, a white educator new to the city, heard whispers about an event in the 1920s and made it the topic of his postgraduate research to Stetson University. Knowing the thesis would spark violence, he decided to keep it private until all of his sources had died. Wow. So these people are so disgusting. You have to worry about them starting violence after they already started violence because I don't want to hear what we did. Get out of here. Dabbs instead became a community mediator. And what about Coretha Perry, July Perry's daughter who escaped that night? She said she would never say the word Ocoee again or even look it up or look at it on a map. But she could not ignore one constant reminder, a scar on her arm from a bullet. There was one place, though, where someone had been sharing the story about the unspeakable in Plymouth at Alan Frank's dining room table. Daddy sometimes had tears in his eyes when he talked because he couldn't understand why anyone would shoot people and take everything they owned. Wow. Frank's Bell says, you could still sense fear, but never hate. I had white friends over to our house to play. Daddy was a father figure to them too. He said, we're all God's children. Alan Franks died in 1994. I still miss him, especially now, Franks Bell says. We could use more people like him today. Boykins is as candid as ever at the age of 70. As she looks out the window of the Orlando law firm where she's worked for 33 years, she acknowledges the marching and the protesting of the Black Lives Matter. We can't just say forget it and move on from injustice, she says, but violence and shouting won't help. We all need to listen to each other. Then we can make progress. We proved it. Okay, so I'm not going to read anymore. About to be 20 minutes in. I will leave this in the description area below. This is another reason why when people are protesting and it turns into riots, I feel nothing, because just 100 years ago, whenever a certain group decided that they wanted to just take things, just steal things, just because they were pieces of shit, they did it. And it was never declared a riot. Nobody ever came to the other people's rescues. No one said anything. All you did was cover it up and brush it under the rug. So now, 100 years later, when your shit's getting taken, or when a few stores get burned down, or when a riot pops up, I feel nothing. I will never freaking say, oh, those poor people, because karma is a bitch. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.